Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and many thanks to all of you for joining us today for this event, which is convened jointly by the Center for Global Development and the Humanitarian Advisory Group. My name is Patrick Sayers. I'm a Senior Policy Fellow with CGD based in London, and my co-host today is Johanna Lavie from HIG in Melbourne. And as you know, today we'll be exploring the future of humanitarian action and humanitarian reform in the Asia-Pacific region. And this conversation is in the context of ongoing discussions at the global level regarding a future humanitarian reform agenda, post-Grand Bargain, and growing calls to accelerate the localization of humanitarian aid. And even going further, calls to decolonize humanitarian action. And most recently, a proposal by the UN's Emergency Relief Coordinator to establish a new commission to improve accountability to people affected by crises. So today we wanted to explore both the enablers and the obstacles to change in the region, but most importantly, to learn from locally led initiatives. So I'm very pleased that we're joined today by three excellent speakers on our panel. Ibu Adelina Kamal has served as the Executive Director for the ASEAN Coordinating Center for Humanitarian Assistance, or AHA Center, since 2017. The AHA Center is the primary ASEAN regional coordinating agency on disaster management and emergency response. It was set up by the 10 ASEAN member states in November 2011. And Ibu Adelina is responsible for operationalizing their declaration on One ASEAN, One Response and implementing the vision for ASEAN to become the global leader in disaster management. As part of her role, Ibu Adelina has facilitated ASEAN's collective response to major disasters, including the emergencies in 2018, where the AHA Center played a major coordinating role. Prior to working with the center, Ibu Adelina served for more than 20 years in the ASEAN Secretariat. We also have Ms. Fine Tuitupu Arnold, who is the Secretary General of the Cook Islands Red Cross Society, which she joined in 2011. And over her time with the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, Fine has worked in the areas of international humanitarian law, disaster risk management, and climate change. She's developed the National Disaster Risk Management Plan for the Cook Islands and reviewed the Cook Islands legislation in the area of disaster response, risk reduction, and climate change. She's a strong advocate for localization, and she's an elected member of the Standing Commission of the Red Cross Movement, a member of the Consultative Committee for the Global Platform for Disaster Displacement, and sits on HIG's advisory board. And last but not least, Pak Puji Pujiono is a proponent of Indonesia's CSOs NGOs Network of Networks, or Sejaja, rallying 26 national sectoral networks and their 600 subnational organizations. He also spearheaded the establishment of the nationwide Indonesian Development Humanitarian Alliance, and he serves as a senior advisor to the Pujiono Center, which is an Indonesian local NGO working in disaster, humanitarian, and social work knowledge management. And he's got 25 years of experience in the UN in various disaster, emergency, and humanitarian agencies. Many thanks again to all three of you for joining us and sharing your thoughts and insights today. And thanks to the audience for actively participating in this event. I would like to encourage those of you who have joined already to ask questions to our panelists using the chat function, which you will see at the bottom of your screen, hopefully. So not the Q&A function, but the chat function. And our panelists will do their best to address them during the Q&A section in about 45 minutes. But first, I'd like to briefly present CGD's work on the future of humanitarian reform. This is a project that was started a couple of years ago by my colleagues Jeremy Conindike, who rejoined USAID earlier this year, Rose Warden, and myself when I join a little bit later. And it stems from a diagnostic that past humanitarian reforms have been mainly technocratic rather than structural. And while they have led to some improvements, their utility has been limited because they haven't challenged the prevailing business model and power dynamics in the sector. It's a business model that's built on strong codependent relationships between large international organizations and their donors. Agencies rely on donor grants to exist, and donors rely on intermediaries to respond to humanitarian crises in a visible way. And this leads to a concentration of resources, as we know, in a handful of large UN agencies. And the inefficiencies this leads to in terms of fragmentation, inefficiency in channeling resources to the front line are well documented. Although ideas to make humanitarian action more locally led and accountable have existed for over 2 decades now, the power balance has never really changed. So at CGD, we looked at what actionable ideas could be envisaged to accelerate change, focusing on the 3 areas of coordination, financing, and accountability. So the first set of recommendations that we've made is to move coordination to an area-based model. And we propose shifting responsibility for the humanitarian program cycle to the subnational level and hubs located at that level, organized according to geography rather than technical sectors. This does not mean doing away with the clusters who have proven to be quite important in past efforts to rationalize humanitarian response, but instead to refocus the clusters on their comparative advantage, which we think is technical oversight. Secondly, on financing, we recommend that donors start what we call financing by function. And I'll explain. One of the main perverse incentives, we think, in the current model is that agencies rely on program grants from donors to resource their core functions, such as their normative functions, their coordination role, their procurement and logistics on behalf of the whole system. Because donors do not provide enough core unearmarked funding. And that leads to an incentive to be the main intermediary between donors and local organizations and national governments. So we're advocating for donors to provide adequate core funding for these core functions in the multilateral system, but to shift much more of the intermediary function to national pool funds, because we believe they are more efficient and effective at channeling funding to the front lines. And finally, we also propose a step change on participation and accountability to affected people, increasing direct representation in governance and coordination structures at all levels. This includes governing boards. For example, we found in a survey of international NGO boards that by and large, their members have no lived experience as a recipient of humanitarian assistance. We also suggest that feedback mechanisms should be independent of operational agencies and that their use in adapting programs should be audited independently. And some of these principles, but not all, unfortunately, were applied in Mark Lowcock's idea for a new independent commission for people's voices last month. So this is a broad overview of our proposals at the global level, which of course we rely on the political will of stakeholders to include them in future reform agendas. And we've found in our discussions with the Humanitarian Advisory Group in Australia that there were actually a lot of synergies with what they've been working on in the region. And I think this is particularly the case with their Blueprint for Change project, which seeks to contextualize these global models to fit national priorities in the region. So I'm going to hand over now to Johanna to explain where they've got to on that initiative. Over to you, Johanna.
Thank you, Patrick. I'm very pleased to be here today with you and with our eminent panelists that have joined us today. And so, yes, we've been working on a research project called the Blueprint for Change over the past few years. And we've been implementing this research in partnership with Puji Pujiono and the Pujiono Centre. And similarly to yourselves, we found that global humanitarian reform really was struggling to achieve some of those transformative changes that it was aiming to do over the years of the transformative agenda and other reform initiatives. And so we developed this research program to develop an evidence base to help progress humanitarian reform at the country level. So we hypothesized that it would be more effective and easier potentially to work towards humanitarian reform within one particular country context rather than trying to reform the international humanitarian system at the global level all at the same time. So we focused on Indonesia for a number of reasons, primarily because in Indonesia there was a real demand for reform and momentum for change, particularly following the response to the Sulawesi earthquake in 2018, where the government of Indonesia limited assistance from international organisations and required many of them to work through local and national actors. So that's really forced the international humanitarian system to work in support of a national humanitarian response mechanism. So there was a real demand within Indonesia to further strengthen how that could best be done. So as part of our research, we've worked alongside humanitarian actors within Indonesia and held a number of workshops looking at, we were initially looking for one key lever for systems change within Indonesia, and we found 4. And that's where the overlap, we found this overlap, so with the CGD research. So we found accountability, finance, coordination, and capacity building were the 4 key areas that really needed to change to achieve this real substantial shift to the humanitarian system. And we were really quite fascinated, Patrick, when we first engaged with Centre for Global Development, and we found that your research at the global level had found those similar areas as well. So we're currently working with Puji and the Pujiono Centre to assess some of these global solutions that Patrick mentioned earlier for reform across these 4 areas and their relevance to Indonesia, to see which may apply and which may not, and what adaptations may need to be taken place. And we have a few products coming out in coming months. So we have a literature review due out shortly, and the results of our current research will be out in a few months' time. And we have a number of reports available on our website if anyone's interested in learning more about the Blueprint for Change research. Thank you, Patrick. I think you're just on mute, Patrick.
Sorry. Thanks. Thanks a lot, Johanna, for that. I mean, I have to say I'm struck once again by how complementary our work is and the richness of experience in the region. I'm going to turn to our panel now to reflect on their experiences and insights on how reform has happened or is happening in the region. What were the obstacles or enabling factors, but also what are the opportunities for even further change in the future, possibly including some of the ideas that Johanna and myself have just talked about. And maybe to start with the COVID response and the humanitarian and health response to COVID, which we're all living at the moment. It's often been referred to as one such opportunity to accelerate reform, particularly in terms of localization, because the usual international aid model of mobilizing resources and sending them over to where the crisis happened didn't really apply in this case, or you know, there were numerous constraints to that model. And I know that in some countries in the Asia Pacific region, this has accelerated the localization of humanitarian responses, while in other countries, local and national organizations still voice their concerns over their repeated exclusion from preparedness and response plans. So let me turn to Fine first. How has, in your view, the pandemic and the response to the pandemic impacted the Cook Islands humanitarian framework, so to speak? Given the restrictions on travel, has coordination and financing been devolved even more to local actors? Over to you, Fine.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Well, the COVID-19 has been a real eye-opener for us here in the Cook Islands, and as with other Pacific microstates, for decades, when we have a disaster, we're allocated funds by international donors, and then they send over experts to tell us what we can or cannot do with the funds, how to run the response according to globally accepted system, and also lead the response. So accountability is not to the victims we help, but to the donors we serve. And this was the practice. And I must say that some of us became very accustomed to it, and were complacent just because changing the system honestly seemed to be out of our control. But this time, things has been very different. Funding is slow to come. No one is allowed to fly in, and we are on our own to lead our own response. And so we could see that we were COVID-free, but we needed to find our own ways to keep safe and to address the huge economic consequences for the country and its people. And this is not a circumstances that the current global humanitarian response system and structure have prepared us for. So therefore, our response was locally driven from day one. In fact, it's really only been in the recent months around the technical assistance and reopening our borders that we have been tapping New Zealand for help with that. And across Polynesia, we are very good at coming together to support each other. And here in the Cook Islands, that same communal response kicked in with enthusiasm and pride in local villages and islands. And at the local level, there has been consistent community support for government's efforts and the help of Red Cross and other stakeholders, and all of us from the health perspective coming together under the umbrella of the Ministry of Health to help. So it has been an interesting response from government. Here, as I'm sure all around the world, we have watched as different agencies of government have tried to find the balance between protecting both lives and livelihoods. But I guess for me, the most striking thing is how this pandemic has highlighted the strength and weaknesses of the local response. The reliance factor has changed. The reliance on international response has changed to rely on local actors and first responders. And with this change, the existing humanitarian response structure and system that connects local actors with resources, I believe needs to change. And so does the power dynamic. It needs to change from international to national. And with hindsight, the pandemic always needed a whole of country approach and a multi-agency approach. However, I think in general, over the years, there has been not enough effort to build the capacity of the country and local agency to be able to rely more on its local context for coordination, or communities to build accountabilities in time of disaster and emergency. So what this means was that when we were slow in the preparedness phase and response, and had quite a lot of early confusions in our local system, and of course, a lack of resources. Thank you, Patrick.
Thanks very much, Fine. Really fascinating lessons, both in terms of how the context has shifted attention towards national and locally led action, but also some of the shortcomings in terms of preparedness and the need to accelerate that while including those actors at the center. So bearing that in mind, I'm going to turn to Adelina to also check to what extent the COVID response has been a pivot for ASEAN member states in particular, and the organization as a whole, to channel more resources through to locally led humanitarian response, whether civil society or government at all levels. Have you seen that practice has already shifted throughout the response, Adelina?
Thank you very much, Patrick, and thank you to you as well as colleagues at Humanitarian Advisory Group for inviting me to join this panel. I have been part of the research actually since the time Pujono Center and Humanitarian Advisory Group conducted the lessons learning from the Central Sulawesi triple disasters, and I think I've been interviewed also a number of times. So it's good to know how far the research has been, and also always excited to be part of the discussion with regard to humanitarian reform. In the case of Southeast Asian region or ASEAN region, I would say that the COVID-19 was not actually the pivot point, but more of an accelerator, like what you said, because the turning point or the realization point was already there even before COVID-19. So in 2016, when the world gathered in Istanbul for the Humanitarian Summit and came up with this grand bargain commitment, we in ASEAN also gathered actually during the sideline of the summit. It was the ministers, ASEAN ministers in charge of disaster management, and Indonesia was the chair at the time. And we came up with the joint statement, joint ASEAN statement, that basically advocated for national and locally led response, enhanced by regional mechanism, and supported by international community as and when necessary. So that's the tagline that we produced as part of the joint statement, while the world community actually produced the Grand Bargain commitment. And you can see that this tagline reappeared, in the disasters that followed. For example, in 2018, when our region suffered from a number of disasters back to back, right? In 2018, we had the Lombok earthquake, we have flooding in the Mekong region, we have Typhoon Mangkut in the Philippines, and then the triple disasters in Central Sulawesi, earthquake, tsunami, and liquefaction. So back-to-back disasters affecting our region in 2018, almost at the same time. And we could see that, at least two countries like Indonesia and Philippines, they were actually quite assertive in informing the international community, as well as regional players like AHA Center. They were assertive in saying what they needed, what they did not need, and advocated for more locally as well as nationally led response by saying, for example, in the case of triple disasters in Indonesia and Central Sulawesi, that only for items, right? Only for offers of types of offer assistance will be welcome. Don't bring your search and rescue dogs and team, because we have enough capacity in the country. And when you would like to channel international resources, better go through the local national actors such as the Indonesian Red Cross, PMI, and also the national actors. So it was really very clear on what actually can come in and can be received. So in this part of the region, even before COVID, there was always this realization that our countries have to be relying on ourselves, and also for the region to be self-sufficient. But then let's talk about the international and the global humanitarian system. We know that the international efforts have been quite slow in realizing the Grand Bargain commitment. So perhaps rather than waiting for the change to happen, why don't we actually advocate the change ourselves? And I like what actually the HAG research conclusion about advocating change at the country level, because that's where the change can happen. If we talk about the global humanitarian system, it has strengths. We have to admit that. Yeah, at least three that I could identify: global funding, aggregated knowledge, and a pool of global expertise and governance in terms of standard, system, and accountability. But all of these are very attractive offers, especially for us who have needs greater than our resources. But these three things within the global humanitarian system have been anchored on a so-called supply-driven ecosystem, vertical. So it will be always dominated by those who manage the resources. So I think we have also to be realistic in this part of the world, because the playing field is different, and it will always be like that unless there is a drastic change from within. Realistically speaking, change will never happen from within the system. Change will always happen from outside the system. So are we going to actually play their playing field, or we create our own playing field? And therefore, I think I would really want to advocate what HAG Research has commissioned together with the Pujono Center, start the change at the country level. And that's where we can actually perhaps later on create the so-called humanitarian equilibrium. So then there will be more diversity in the ecosystem, and it's no longer driven by only a handful of those who dominate the system because they have the resources to do so. So I'll stop at that and perhaps entertain some more questions later on. Thank you.
Thanks, Adelina. Johanna, did you want to pick up on
Yes.
these comments in Indonesia?
Thank you, Adelina. It's fascinating to hear how much the country level approach really resonates from your experience and the work that you've been doing from the AHA Center. I'd like to talk a little bit now about coordination, and obviously within the international humanitarian system, that the international coordination system hasn't quite got it right for really strong local led responses or really strong nationally led responses. As Adelina picked up, there's quite a few advantages to the international humanitarian system, but there's a few gaps as well. Pak Pujono, I know you've been doing a lot of thinking about what that might look like from the national perspective. I was wondering if you would share with us some of your thoughts on what international coordination or coordination systems look like from the national Indonesian perspective.
Thank you, Johanna. Also, colleagues, it's an honor to be part of this distinguished panel. I will attempt to reflect on those big questions. Why this grand bargain and international humanitarian has not worked the way we wanted, and where it is heading, right? But in the course of doing that, perhaps one reflection that I have, perhaps in addition to questioning the international system, maybe it's worth it also to look at what the local realities looks like. And I would like to do that. If I may take just a short time to share with you some of my thoughts, because my English is not so good, so I'm much better with pictures, right? So if you don't mind, I would like to share just one slide presentation, short while. Asking that question, demand-driven humanitarian action, the way we see it from localities, maybe this is what it looks like from the local perspective, right? First, from the local perspective, disaster, crisis, humanitarian, all of this to us is just the same, actually. We don't attach any label to this. It is the international community that attach label to this. For us, it's a disruption of life, right? That's one. Number two, whatever happened at the local level, very rarely it becomes a headlines in our country. And even less become headlines or even enter a blip in your international radar. So clearly, we're talking about crisis in totally different perspective, you know. The third one, when this thing happens in our community, because we live here together, we respond to this together, right? We do this the best that we can with whatever we have, all right? And, you know, with everyone who wants to do it. Now, next to that, that's being said, there are religious organizations, there are women associations, there are student associations, there are development advocacy organizations, some of them sectarian, some of them vegetarian, you know, people who eat only vegetable. But none of them is calling themselves humanitarian. I don't know what humanitarian eats, though. I mean, comparing it with vegetarian, you know, do they eat human? But joke aside, none of our organization at the local level call ourselves humanitarian. We just do it, you know. And then next to that, we do this not only during the crisis. We do our work before the crisis, at the height of the crisis, or even when it's removed from headlines. We still have to do it. In Lombok, 2 years after the event, we still have to do it at the local level. So that demarcation is artificial demarcation was made by someone else, not by our local perspective. Next to that is that the crisis response, Johanna, is part of the mandate that's given to us, or we assume that mandate as servant leaders to our communities. As local government, as NGOs, we position ourselves as the one who serves the community, including dealing with crisis, with or without anybody's assistance. Right? Now, surely we also realize that whatever we do is not perfect. We have a lot of gaps. So any assistance are welcome. We rarely request for it, but if anybody is willing to help, they are welcome. You know, 94% of people in Aceh earthquake and tsunami, they were assisted by their neighbors, not by international community. We didn't ask, you guys push it. So we accepted, right? That's being said though, all of these are welcome, but we would love it if those guests would also behave like guests. So you knock the door, you present your face, you tell us what you want to do, not another way around. You have your own meeting, you call local leaders to present it, you know, those are reverse role. Maybe, Johanna, that's in a comical way, you know, an iconic way, that perspective of locals. And no wonder that we have been talking different language at different frequency, and you try to fix this big machine upstairs, but we on the ground, we don't see the same thing, you see. Why wasting this energy in doing that? Talk to us. Maybe that's enough for now. Thank you, Johanna.
Thank you so much, Pakuji. And it's such an important reminder, I think, that international actors are guests in countries where we're responding to humanitarian crises, and it's important to act that way. And I've learned so much, Pakuji, from working with you throughout this process, but through sharing that perspective that you have just now, I think is so important to how we think through humanitarian reform and how it can best function at the country level going forward. So thank you kindly for sharing.
Johanna, if we want to encapsulate this in 3 things. Number 1, okay, that the so-called humanitarian for us is just an event, okay, it's a continuum, right? Number 2, what so-called crisis is not confined in certain time. The time is so fluid, and the players are not humanitarian. So I guess colleagues from international community, I submit to them, think of to work with those who are non-humanitarian, right? And that's the perspective, so that developmental advocacy could work on it. And finally, Johanna, I believe that now that humanitarian response should be just like the picture I presented, like a lifesaver buoy, you know, like this. Everybody should know how to do it, like a cardiac massage, CPR, Heimlich maneuver. We need to do it. We hope we'll never use it. All NGO must know, but we hope we'll never use it. Maybe that's the way to lock it in. Thank you, Joanna.
Thank you, Pakuji. And I think there's been some interesting overlap between some of your points and some of the points Ms. Finney was raising earlier about the importance of a lot of this capacity, the reliance being on local and national capacities and abilities rather than the international that has flown in previously and hasn't been able to in the COVID response. Ms. Finney, I was wondering if you might be able to speak to the coordination system a little bit for us and your experience of the cluster system. And I'm not sure if you have any thoughts on the area-based coordination system that organisations like Centre for Global Development have proposed as potential ways of strengthening or plugging gaps in the current coordination system and how that might play out in the context that you operate in.
Thank you very much, Shannon. Well, I think in practice, the cluster system has never really had an opportunity to showcase its worth in the Cook Islands. So I might not be the best person to talk to this from first-hand experience, but I do aware of how it works across the Pacific. And in just the one occasion that this cluster system could have been of use for that purpose. It's one of our cyclones, biggest cyclone here in the Cook Islands that hit one of our outer islands. But just the fact that the response was on an outer island with a strong vocal community means that the shortcoming of the cluster system became pretty clear to us. So, in my opinion, I really believe that in a small island state, the cluster system is always going to struggle and in tension with the dynamic on the ground. In COVID, with limited health resources we have avoided funding COVID and non-COVID health response to the one venue, but choosing to use area-based coordination. And this filled that particular gap over many months. However, having been trained under the cluster system and the idea that is the best system for emergency, we have found ourselves having to adapt as we went along. And there has been a lot of confusion in coordination challenges right throughout. So I don't think that we should be asking community and those involved in the response to be adapting on the run as we have over the past year. Instead, I think we need the system internationally, regionally, and nationally to find the flexibility to shape around this context-specific response. And I put the challenge in this way because from where I sit, we are all talking about small island states here and with very limited resources. Thank you, Hannah.
Great points. Thank you kindly, Ms. Finney. Patrick, can I hand over to you for the next question?
Sure. Thank you very much. And thank you to our panelists for their contributions. I mean, I think that the main thread for me so far that struck me is really this core message to start with the country and not to. I mean, Adelina was talking about the supply-driven system. Pakuji was very eloquently given the perspective from the community level in terms of the conceptual framework for humanitarian assistance, which doesn't really match what the international community sees it's doing. So this core message of really starting with the local experience, the local capacity, the government's own experience. But of course, as Ibu Adelina was saying, one of the main values of the international humanitarian system is the funding it brings, the resources it brings, both in terms of human resources and financial resources. And as I was saying, we know that donors, because they need those international intermediaries, channel their funds through large UN agencies and multilateral agencies and international NGOs. And that drives a lot of the power imbalances and confusion that that Ms. Fina was referring to in the system. So, and another point that you made was that local and national organizations continue to grapple with limited resources that could better prepare them to respond themselves. So I just wanted to touch on this idea that country-led pooled funds would potentially be feasible and a practical solution to direct resources more quickly to national and local actors. And turning to you, Ibu Adelina, first, I was just wondering whether you had, in the ASEAN framework with member states, had any discussions on pooled funds. Are member states in the region interested in pooling their own resources, for example? And how do you see pooled funds potentially helping with directing financing more quickly to national and local actors?
Thank you, Patrick, for that question. I did some analysis, with regard to the strengths of the global humanitarian system, but also the strengths of the national and local actors. Unfortunately, if we use the analogy of a pyramid, right, starting from international, regional, sub-regional like ASEAN, national, local, area-based. Unfortunately, those at the local and area-based level are down at the lowest the lowest food chain, right, in the hierarchy or in the pyramid, and so if we are actually waiting for all of this to trickle down from the top, I think we will not be able to get the required resources that we want and that we need, because it will always have to go through that hierarchy. So I think the country pooled resources or regional pooled resources actually can create the balance, right? And also offer some kind of a self-reliance for the country as well as for the local actors. And perhaps through the regional pooled funds can also create resilience for the region. But I would say, one could be this country-based pooled funds, but there is also another alternative approach, which actually has been narrated by many out there. And this is about the alternative approach, that there will be a sparring partner to the global humanitarian system that will offer resources as much as or even bigger than what the global humanitarian system can offer. And they may be actually market-based and may not be humanitarian principled. And they will not be talking to us, any one of us, right? Because they will just do it themselves. So that actually is something that we can look out, and then it may actually challenge the status quo. But rather than waiting for either the global humanitarian system to change drastically, within which will never happen, or waiting for the sparring partner to happen, why don't we create change ourselves, like for what I mentioned earlier, right? So within ASEAN, we have a resource mobilization strategy. It's not that it's not that we are saying we don't need external funding or the global resources, no. But we are saying that we need to be also self-reliant. So we have to maximize the ability to mobilize resources externally, but also maximize our internal, develop our internal funding and resource mobilization mechanism. And one of them could be regional pool or country pool funds. Now, in ASEAN, at least there are two already regional pool funds, right? The AHA Center Fund, everybody paid the same. Every country on annual equal basis, mandatory, they have to pay through the AHA Center so that AHA Center can be up and running. And then there's another fund, we call it the Disaster Management Emergency Relief Fund or ADMER Fund, that is on voluntary base. And currently, actually, is put in our work program that was just released last November. Currently, there's a study that will look into the format of the ADMER Fund to allow for resources to come not only from the public sector, but also from the people sector. So making use of the fact that we are over 650 million people in ASEAN. So there's a lot of potentials out there where we can actually mobilize our own resources within the region or within the country, right? We're developing, many of us are developing countries, and in years to come, ASEAN is going to be the fourth largest economy in the world. But it's also a reality, right, that not everybody is the same. Not all of the ASEAN countries are at the same level of development. There are challenges with regard to development. So I guess that's also where regional cooperation comes in. And I guess apart from the country pool, then we can also explore regional pool funds. So those who can offer, more resources or are more resilient than the others can also help one another. I think apart from the fact that we are now looking into changing the structure of the ADMER Fund or make it more, open for the public to contribute, there is also now a talk where the ASEAN region should be more anticipatory. So it's not only putting money and then mobilizing them when there is a disaster, when the disaster becomes so acute, but also making it, making our resources full and can be mobilized before the disaster gets big. So this is related to anticipatory action and forecast based, especially because 90% of the disasters in ASEAN region, 90% annually can be anticipated. So I think we need more resources pulled for that purpose, anticipatory action, and that's where we really need to work with the local and national actors. That's where the focus should be. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ibu Adelina, and really fascinating your last point in terms of, if there are pooled funds that are being created, create them with the intent for them to be anticipatory, because that's really what the region needs. It's not really country-based pooled funds for response, but for anticipation that, from what you were saying, I took to be needed in the region. And I was wondering on that subject, Pak Puji, whether you think that in Indonesia in particular, there is a potential for, donors, whether they are international or national or even local, to pooled funds for response or anticipation. And what do you think that would bring to the kind of power balance and relationship between donors and national decision makers, but also local civil society organizations that you were describing so vividly before? Do you think that has the potential to reset that power dynamic and potentially improve even decision making to make it more attuned to what is needed at the local level in Indonesia?
Thank you, Patrick. I should start this with an unequivocal statement that we are grateful to all the supports that have been provided by international community. in the name of humanitarian imperatives. That's unequivocal. Together with that, there are two other facts that probably noteworthy. Number one, Indonesia, as 95% other countries of the world, are actually a functioning government. We are not failed state. There is government budget, there is government plan and logic, and even contingencies that are in place. And the second one, in many of these countries, particularly Indonesia, who supposedly claim to be a middle-income country, this is a self-perpetuating, label, but it is being considered as middle income, if you like, and many other countries are aspire to be so. And that brings a situation where the Indonesian people, Indonesians are known globally as one of the most generous people in giving alms. And we are the largest Muslim country in the world. So the amount of religious-driven fund in Indonesia is not to joke about. It's huge, all right? Going back to the first statement, but we are grateful to the assistance that has been surrendered to us. That's being said, though. At the local level, there have been movement, there have been organization where funds are being mobilized locally, where our zakat, alms, infaq, and all of this very much organized now. Gone were the days of the 60s where the missionaries coming with fund from outside. Now the international mobilization is so vigorous, right? That's being said, though, we need to have a good mix of this national and locally driven funds with that of international. Some of the lessons that we get, Pak Patrick, I think we have been looking at the international community that has been operating on the basis of organized alms, if you like. Although later there's a movement, this is our common responsibility. But they are operating with taxpayers' money and donation and what's not. And they have this stewardship over the resources, Pak Patrick. They felt responsible to make sure that the international fund is being used in a proper way, not be corrupted, not to be misused, and so on. So the whole system has been built on the basis of mistrust and distrust. I feel that organizations from a European country, they would feel so much comfortable if they see organization at the local level that has the same outlook like their own organization. So they would like to have to see mini-me's, if you like, Oh, my name is, Association of Evangelical or something. They would like to have Indonesia Evangelical Organization and what's not. But they found resonance and they feel comfortable. Organizations will only be given fund if they are publicly audited for 3 times in a row with budget more than $500,000. Where in local organizations like that? By default, we got eliminated. And by default, there are the usual suspect who get the money. Those are all the story of the past. But now with the pool fund, there's a hope. Indonesia has gone through an experience, valuable experience, with the Friends of Environment pooled funding in the mid-90s, and it worked really well. Now it's time for us to look at that for humanitarian, Pak Patrick. How does it work? As you said earlier in CGD's proposal, maybe now the national NGOs or consortium or alliance could be the intermediary. Maybe we'll collect less rent along the way. You know what I mean? Pujono Center has conducted 15 research on localization. And we know exactly in every turn of the fund, from Netherlands all the way to Central Sulawesi, it goes to how many turns. In every corner, there's somebody collecting rent. So maybe if we're sitting in Indonesia among ourselves, maybe we will collect rent, but not that much. Maybe we know our friends. Maybe we don't have to ask our local friend, you have to be publicly audited. Hey, yeah, you're my friend, let's do it together. Maybe little corruption, but not that big. Why? We know them. If they corrupt, they will be ashamed. right? But that being said, that resources configuration, Pak Patrick, I believe will change the configuration of the power. If you trust us at the national level, now that Indonesia have the National Alliance of Development and Humanitarian, I tell you, not in a long time, we will be inviting the donors to sit with us and to tell us what is your financing scheme. Instead of we knocking their door being turned away 10 times, now we invite them, come to our meeting, explain to us, what are your modalities? If you don't fit with us, go somewhere else. We'll work with our own money. We'll sell our trousers, I will sell our cars, we'll do it ourselves. No, that's a joke, you know. But what I'm saying is the term and modalities could be negotiated in a more dignifying way, built more on trust, you know, and hopefully the world will be better then. With local government, then we will have more faith because we are tapping into local government too, Pak Patrick. They have, as I said, they have budgets, they have regulation. We're talking to them. So we try to infuse this into some sort of pooled fund. It's not here yet, but we start talking about it. And hopefully we find a better balance, if you like, a better mix of local fund, government fund, and international supports in a more manageable way. Thank you, Pak Patrick.
Thanks, Puji. And it's fascinating how that complemented what Ibu Adelina was saying. I mean, there's definitely this potential at the governmental and regional level with increasing economic strength to provide official resources. But Puji, it was very clear that in the case of Indonesia, it's the networking efforts of the Indonesian civil society who don't necessarily call themselves humanitarian, but who happen to respond to crises when they happen. It's that networking that is helping shape what this could look like in practice in the future in terms of establishing local or national pool funds. That's
in addition, I think it also requires a little bit of flexibility, you know. The fact that the players are not calling themselves humanitarian, the fact that we don't only work during crisis, it means the humanitarian conventional humanitarian fund will need to open itself and be more generous, more understanding to accommodate this cross-sectional work, to allow us to work in the development and crisis, you know. At the same time, we address the nexus of humanitarian development. So, thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Pak Puji. I'm going to turn to Johanna now on the next question.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Patrick. And thank you, Pak Puji and Ibu Adelina, for your comments there on funding. I think it's really interesting how important funding is to be able to design and deliver humanitarian response that is what is actually needed on the ground and can be most effective on the ground, and can really support what CGD is now referring to as this people-driven aid, and the importance of accountability in humanitarian response at whatever level and from whoever is implementing and leading that aid. I have a question this time with Fine. If you would be able to talk to us, Ms. Fine, about your experiences with people-driven aid and any examples of accountability mechanisms that the Red Cross has used that you have seen that have been really effective in putting decision-making power and accountability into the hands of aid recipients.
Thank you very much, Johanna. Well, the Red Cross and the Red Crescent's movement is, as you may well know, that they are strongly rooted in local communities. And so we are committed to being accountable, to be transparent and to be answerable to the community that we serve. And it's 192 national societies. The movement has the advantage of in-country actors who can give local color and flavor to how we can deliver on these goals. So the International Federation of Red Cross has guidelines and toolkits that seek to support national societies to strengthen their practices of engaging with local communities. And more recently, in 2019, the movement has increased its efforts in this area by passing a movement-wide commitment and minimum actions for community engagement and accountability. But as we know that there is no one-size-fits-all. So we use a variety of feedback mechanisms, collecting, analyzing, and addressing complaints, questions, rumors, concerns, and suggestions from communities through a variety of channels. It's face-to-face, interactive radio shows, and online, and etc. So this community feedback can sometimes be addressed directly by our volunteers. In other cases, it can be referred up and then addressed from higher level. And one example of what else we do with this kind of feedback to inform our programming is our regional feedback dashboard for COVID-19 that's showing data from Nepal, from Indonesia, and from Bangladesh. The link, I will share it after this on our chat space. Some national societies also build community committees to take part in the decision-making about programs. For instance, they will co-develop selection criteria for cash distribution and impact how the programs are implemented. And ideally, things that are developed at a global level are tested locally. And we try to design it in a way that provides a kit or toolkit for national societies to construct their own approach tailored to the resources available and to the cultural and societal context in which we seek that feedback. For instance, the International Federation of Red Cross has a global guidance, the feedback starter kit, which was developed based on the needs and experiences of national societies, based on their existing work and interviews. And it was road tested in 2 countries. And even the development phase, the takeaway lessons was of the need for contextual flexibility. And for this reason, Johanna, the kit has all the key guidance. For instance, how to handle sensitive data, but often gives the questions that local staff should ask themselves when doing feedback mechanism rather than prescribing answers. It has plenty of templates which are all adaptable to different contexts. So in summary, Johanna, the movement aims to have national societies develop processes to systematically listen to, engage, and communicate with people and communities. And the core idea is customer satisfaction. We aim to better understand their diverse needs, vulnerabilities, and capacity, and together respond to and act on the feedback and input about their priorities and preferences. So once we understand that, then we are able to to communicate their needs outward, regionally, and also globally. And this really is about working to provide safe, equitable access and opportunities to actively participate in decisions that affect those that we seek to help. Thank you, Joanna.
Thank you, Ms. Vinay, for sharing the very rich experience and expertise of Red Cross. And it's really interesting to hear that concept of customer satisfaction, but also combined with the very important elements of safety and being able to participate and communicate safely. Thank you for sharing that. I'll just ask one more final question of our panelists before I throw to Patrick for questions from our audience here today. Eva Adelina, you shared some really fascinating ideas with us earlier on funding and called funding mechanisms. And I'd love to hear from you on people-driven aid and accountability, and if you have any ideas on how that can best be strengthened and progressed at the regional level.
Thank you, Jo. My predecessor, Syed Faisal, the first ED of AHA Center for the first 5 years of AHA Center, invented this methodology called CPM, copy, paste, and modify. So I've mentioned earlier that the global humanitarian system offers with them, one of them, governance, right? That includes global standards, global systems, as well as the accountability mechanisms. So I think we at the regional, even at the national local level, can learn from that. But then we have to contextualize, right? Can contextualize them into the local practices as well as needs. That's where the methodology comes in: copy, paste, and modify. Now we have talked about the strengths of global humanitarian system, but there are also the strengths of the local and national actors, and these are better understanding on the context and knowledge, right? Having a better knowledge of the local context, ability to adapt and change, you know. And also acceptability and trust, because we are closer to the ground, we are closer to the affected people. So I guess if we combine this, right, learning from the global in terms of the governance standard and system, and then contextualize them into our local needs and practices, and I think that will be wonderful, rather than the inventing, you know, the wheel. So that's one. Now, in terms of who should be coordinating this, right, in terms of governance, well, I would be very tempted to say it should be AHA Center at the regional level, but it doesn't have to be. I think rather than, you know, we determine the format, the way to do it, I think we need to do the benchmarking first. We need to do, you know, the adaptation first, but it should not be the one implementing the activities on the ground, because we need to make sure that you know, is independent. It can also be a consortium of multi-stakeholders. So then there is this humanitarian equilibrium. Right? Nobody actually has more power than the others, right? That because if we actually allow some actually to control the governance and not actually provide the balance, then we basically replicate what actually happened at the global level. So it has to be a more decentralized ecosystem when it comes to governance, perhaps the way I see it, right? So then, you know, the different actors can come in and then also provide their idea, kind of like balance of the power. Yeah, so that's what I would like to suggest. I also like what Fini said earlier, you know, in the first answering the first question, that so far it has been that what has been created in terms of accountability is not accountability to the people, but accountability to the funders, right? So I'm thinking perhaps, and this is related to technology, the use of technology as enabler. We are now into the 5th industrial revolution, and I was told that this is where technology will enable us to cut layers, to cut those who become the middlemen. And then we will have a more personalized approach, and we will be able to talk more directly to the people, to the affected communities. It's not going to be wholesome approach anymore. It's going to be a retail. It's more customized because of technology. And that actually can be utilized to help us in terms of pushing for accountability. And the third point I want to say, why don't we work with the governments on this? When we already develop capacity internally, right, at the national and the country level and at the local level, when we have adapted the global system, when we have learned, you know, from whatever that is offered from the top, and then, you know, we were able to be able to determine this is what we need and this is what we don't need. I would say that we can work with the government, and perhaps some of those in the global system may not like it, but it's already happening. Yeah, at least in this part of the region, that the government can actually help regulate the system, regulate the way international system and international system can come in terms of capacity building, work with the local and national actors to determine the success indicator, the finish line. So then there is no more rent or economic rent, as Puji said, that we actually can absorb the technology and the knowledge offered, but there has to be clear finish line so that we are not getting capacity building for 50 years and it's all the same. That's one. Second, in terms of indicators for international assistance after disaster happens, then we also can work with the government, like what Indonesian government did for Central Sulawesi or the Philippine government did for the Typhoon Mangkhut, that we determine what we can accept based on our needs, but we also have to develop internally first to be able to say what we need, right? And it's much more difficult to do that, to manage and welcome offers of international assistance rather than to give assistance. And therefore, I think it's very important for countries that are prone to disasters, including Southeast Asia, including the Pacific, right? Those in Asia Pacific, basically, including South Asia, that we learn how to manage offer of international assistance, that we become the hospital manager, that we can determine the kind of fruits and vegetables that can come to the patient, and we determine the time of the visits and teach them on the manners on when actually fruits and vegetables can come in to the patients. And that has to be actually the role of the government. The role of the government, both at the national and local actors, to be able to say that. But then internally, we also have to be responsible to our population. We also have to internally capacitate ourselves so that we will be able to be more resilient, more reliant. We will be able to be on our own feet. Yeah. So that's all in terms of accountability. Thank you.
That's all, Adelina. That was very comprehensive and a point very well made. I think the role of the government and the importance of being clear of what is needed and having the ability to do that. And your point that it is much more difficult to welcome in international assistance than to give it. I think that point is very well made. And of being responsible to national populations as well. I think it's fascinating to see how governments in the Asia Pacific are doing this already, and it's great to see. I'm really looking forward to seeing how that further develops in the future, and with the support of the AHA Centre and the work that you're doing behind the scenes to help governments prepare for things like that. It's a very exciting development. I'll hand over now to Patrick for Q&A, questions from the audience.
Thanks, Johanna. We've got a few questions coming in. And the first one is actually quite interesting because it's asking the panel for their views, not so much on what should happen in their countries, but actually, if all these changes happen, what do you think then should be the role of international humanitarian organizations? And the question is particularly on the role of international NGOs, actually. How should their role evolve? I mean, Papuji mentioned that there's a tendency somehow to want to replicate international organizations in receiving countries. Is that the way to go? Or should international organizations think of their role differently? I think that's a question that's potentially relevant to everyone in the panel, but maybe starting with you, Papuji.
Sure. I guess we could start with my most important statement. The NGOs are guests. So please behave as guests. That's a starting point, right? Number two, INGOs are the custodian of the excellence, the principles and technical standards. The fact that you are international, that you dare to put tattoo on your forehead that you're humanitarian workers, you proclaim to know, to embody the principles and technical aspects of humanitarians. We don't, we are local people. We live with our agriculture and firefighting and what's not. As I said earlier, our crisis, disasters, disruption, and humanitarian, they look the same to us. You are the one who call it humanitarian. So come and tell us what is humanitarian in our context. What is the basic principles? How do we do that? Right? So you're the custodian. You bring it to us. The third one, of course, that we are living like under the small dome of localities, although now we have interconnectivity everywhere, Patrick. But by far, INGOs are the one who have the broader steps and longer and broader perspective. You know how colleagues in Solomon Islands deal with water salination, purification, for example. We should not fail in trying. You share with us those good practices, right? So you also the custodian of good practices, INGOs. And listen, I don't think it's proper for INGOs to bend themselves, become a network, and then you get all the international money, you operate it yourself, and then you treat us like cheap laborers. I don't think it's proper. It's inappropriate, my friend. Don't do that, right? Or you clone yourself into, oh, I am the Save the Elderly organization, and then you create Indonesia Save the Elderly organization. And then you compete with us locally in our market. But you have the international system behind you and your PR and everything. I don't think that's the way to be guest, you know. I'm sorry, this is an old man, so scolding young people. No, but look, you are our friends, all right? Let's work together, walk side by side with us. Don't walk in front of me because I might stumble upon you. Don't walk behind me. I might leave you behind. So here, walk next to my heart on my side. Be a good friend. That's the role. Thank you.
Thanks, Puji. Very clear and powerful message that maybe there needs to be a shift towards kind of more of a solidarity approach between international and national NGOs rather than a kind of supplier chain approach. Fine, how does this translate into the Red Cross movement? Do you see a different role emerging or needing to emerge for the international parts of the movement and how they cooperate with you?
Thank you very much, Patrick, and very interesting. I really enjoy listening to Puchai on all your ideas and belief, and I totally agree with you. I mean, it's been a long time we have been saying all these things. It seems like nobody's listening, and in my situation, it's a bit different because I belong to an organization that is part of an international organization that walks and talks like an INGO. But, you know, it's the same principles and same struggle we have that you have with your international NGOs that internally, speaking from my national society, we do have that struggle as well with our international organization, IFRC and ICRC. And I would say this, that I say to them all the time, and IFRC is supposed to be the secretariat of the national societies, and we are the members, we are the owner of IFRC. But somehow they act so much like an INGO and keep most of the funding with them, and then they start responding to disasters internationally, and with or without the national society. So I always say to them, your role is only to develop our capacity to respond to our disaster. So if there is a cyclone in the Cook Islands and the Cook Islands Red Cross cannot respond because we don't have the capacity, it's a reflection of a failure of your role. In good time, you're supposed to develop my capacity to be able to effectively respond in the local level. So as you said, Puja, stay at your line, keep to your mandate, and do it well. And it is a complementary working relationship. If you keep to that, I will keep to, working with my communities, with my own context, and we can, you can be our technical advisor, and that is their role. It's only when they step outside of that it becomes a problem. But in general, INGO should stick to only the capacity building part and also to be technical advisor. It's when they start expanding to, step over to the national response side and start to take control over our response that it'll become a problem. Definitely. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Fine. We have a question that I might ask Ibu Adelina to respond. Well, a couple of questions on domestic resources, whether they are public or potentially also from diaspora communities. Question as to whether there are systems in place at the national or regional level to mobilize but also channel those resources to potentially local actors.
First of all, I'd like to join Pak Puji and Fini here about the reality, right? The painful fact that we have. Even for us as a regional organization, like a regional coordinating agency set up by the 10 countries, I have to keep reminding myself and also my colleagues and each other that our intention is not to make AHA Center stronger than the ASEAN countries, because we were created by the ASEAN countries. We are here to serve the ASEAN peoples and the ASEAN countries. So our objective is fulfilled when the ASEAN countries are stronger. So it is not for us to make AHA Center strong. Yes, but to make ASEAN countries stronger, and that includes the people. And sometimes it can be quite painful, right? Because we want to make ourselves stronger, but then we also have to realize we were created by ASEAN and for ASEAN, right? It's not that we're going to replace the capacity of the sorry, that's my city. We cannot replace the capacity of the national and local government. They have to be actually at the front level. So I think that also the realization that our international NGO and the global humanitarian community should have, that at the end of the day, it is actually the country, it is the local population that will respond to the disasters first. They can help one another first. And that has to be our success indicators. Right, our success indicators is not for us to be the heroes or the saviors of the world, but actually to make those who actually can save the people to be capable in terms of helping each other. So that is one. So in terms of the resources, I guess I would advocate for resources or country resources first, right? Regional, yes, needed, but country first, the way I see it, no? And then regional can help to actually add value in terms of filling up the gaps, because there may be countries within our regional grouping that may not have all the resources. So we are there just to fill up the gaps, right? But then it has to always be remembered, even for regional and international actors, when we actually are pulling resources, it's not for ourselves, guys. we are just facilitating. We are the facilitator. So as long as it actually sticks in our head that whatever money comes, it actually goes to us, then then there, it the hospital manager mentality, or whatever the patient mentality that I've mentioned, we will not change. So I guess I will stop at that. The attitude has to change first. The system can be modified later.
Thanks, Ibu Adelina. Very, very powerful few words, and I think that echoes what Puji and Fina was saying, that there really needs to be almost a cultural shift in the way the international system approaches national responses in the region. Time is running short, unfortunately, so I might ask one final question to all our panelists. It's a question that's come in to us as well. Maybe if you could summarize one way in which this international process that's happening at the moment, discussing what should happen after the grand bargain, should there be a grand bargain 2.0 or something else, how could this international process meaningfully engage national, local, even regional actors and the perspectives that you've all shared with us today? Puji, maybe starting with you first.
I guess what I could say about Patrick is the art of tinkering, the art of going around, try to fix the broken system, may running out of time. The opportunity is here now with the COVID engulfing us, where we are being forced by circumstances to keep our head above the water. Let's seize the opportunity. Stop tinkering with the system. Let's make a radical change. Be brave. Seize the moment. Carpe diem. Let's say that and see what the real change. Otherwise, oh, we'll change a little bit of funding here. We'll change the intermediary. Wouldn't work. That's my message.
Thanks, Puji. Hopefully that message will be heard loud and clear. Fine, did you have any thoughts on how from the Cook Islands, for example, to engage in those global processes? How is that going, and how that could be improved?
Thank you very much, Patrick. I really think, like Puji said, this is an opportunity. And I think with the COVID situation, there will be a natural flow of changes, because the whole response on the ground have dramatically changed. We don't have any more experts flying in. Everything has moved on to online. And it has dramatically changed. And I really think there will be a natural flow of change in the positive way for all of us. And what we have been advocating in the last 2-3 years will come into fruition. And I think I am very optimistic that there will be changes, and it's going to be for the betterment of all of us local responders. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you for that positive note. Adelina, maybe a few last words on how, from your perspective, the ASEAN or the region is engaged or not, or should be engaged in those discussions on the future of humanitarian reform.
Thank you. Well, I would follow up from what Fini said. If we don't change, somebody will do the change for us. And this is going to be the Elon Musk of humanitarian system. And they will not discuss it with us. Elon Musk didn't discuss with Toyota, BMW, or Mercedes before he created this electric car, right? So somebody will do the change. And there is this so-called industrial revolution, technology as enabler for the humanitarian system to change, like what I mentioned before, COVID-19. People are pushing for change. So if we don't change, then somebody will do the change for us. However, somehow I'm quite skeptical that radical or drastic change will come from within. And therefore, I really advocate for the change to come from the outside, like what we're doing right now. In Asia Pacific, start with the country level, something that can be done pragmatically and realistically. I believe that Asia Pacific can be the advocate for change because we have hosted them in AHA Center together with BNPB, global regional consultations for localization, and I see that there are potentials out there. So perhaps rather than waiting for us to be called for the global consultation, why don't we change the seat and organize the consultations ourselves and organize the change led and hosted by HAG and yourself, Patrick. That's all from me. Thank you so much for inviting us.
Thank you so much, Ibu Adelina. A very strong message, and I think which echoes what our two other panelists have said, that rather than waiting for global change processes, change will happen through practice, and change will happen from the national and local level. We're running out of time. We've run out of time already, actually. So before we close, I'm going to hand over to Johanna, maybe for a few final thoughts. And thanks again so much to you and the HAG team for organizing this event with us.
Thank you, Patrick, and thank you to CPB for organising this as well and initiating it. We've been very pleased to work with you on this one, and a big thank you to our panelists today. I've just been thinking through how to wrap this up a little bit, and I'm not sure I can quite do it justice. The thoughts and the thinking that have come out of this conversation has been so rich. Just to pick up on a couple of points that have really stood out to me. I think one, obviously starting with the importance of country-led or contextual humanitarian aid and humanitarian systems, and how difficult this is in a system that is set up where accountability is currently to donors rather than to recipients of aid. I think to your point, Pooji, that internationals are guests in these situations, and it's really important that internationals behave as such, is very well made and well taken. The importance of developing self-reliance within countries to strengthen humanitarian systems in ways that countries would like to run the humanitarian action, and the role of government in doing that, and self-regulation. The importance of relying on first and local responders, as has happened in the Cook Islands through the COVID response. That there is opportunity to leverage some international resources, particularly around finance and technical expertise in governance, and that a number of the international systems across the system, the funding mechanisms and accountability mechanisms can all be contextualized in different ways to help strengthen the system. And I'd really like to just reiterate some of the more optimistic forward-looking points, that there is opportunity in these good times to work together and to figure this out together, and that currently with COVID and with the Industrial Revolution, as you pointed out, Ibu Adelina, there's real momentum for change, and we'd love to see it led by the Asia Pacific, and not waiting for the international humanitarian system to figure it out. So thank you again to all our panelists today. I have learned so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Johanna. And again, I'd like to extend my thanks to Ibu Adelina, Ms. Fine, and Pak Pooji for joining us today. I think this discussion it was fascinating. It shows again how much the international humanitarian system can learn from national and local actors, and particularly from the strength of experience and practice in the region. Thank you very much for your very clear and strong messages that humanitarian reform will happen in the region without waiting for a global process to be implemented at the national and local level. So I hope stakeholders who are discussing the future of the Grand Bargain at the moment will hear that message loud and clear. Thank you very much. And thank you also for our audience questions and participation. Have a wonderful rest of your day.